Thanks, Nico, and thanks, Urbanism, next for having me. This has been a packed day, writing down a ton of notes, and you all have really, really made the most of a digital virtual format. So just happy to be a part of it. I will go ahead and share my screen. Here we go.
Yeah, perfect.
So as Nico said, part of my question is this the new normal? Is that what we want to get back to? Earlier today, Ron from Fair and Peers talked a little bit about the new normal. Alex from SDOT was talking about what we're seeing as normal now. And so it's just something that we're all asking ourselves. So I think we're going to do a poll. Great. So just, checking in with folks, it's been a long day. I'm in the afternoon. If you just ate lunch like me, you might be tired. So just to have you do a little bit of participation, a lot has changed during this global health pandemic. Do you wish things could go back to normal? And we'll just give you just a few seconds to answer. Great. So only 28% of people say yes, and 72% of people say no. So maybe 72% of you are kind of picking up on the way that I'm also feeling and what I'm also thinking. And so a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Nebraska, a proud Midwesterner. People of color do live in the Midwest. And I moved out to California to go to law school at Stanford. And when I graduated, I had a postgraduate fellowship to start a workers' rights clinic in the low income Black communities of San Francisco, which were disappearing, the Western Addition Fillmore and Bayview Hunters Point. And this just happened to be the time where a new Muni line was going to the Bayview, and I was this young lawyer who wanted to talk to everyone about their employment issues. But to gain trust in this community that I wasn't from, the first question everyone asked me was, where do you stand on this new Muni line? And people were frustrated. They felt like they hadn't been talked to. They felt like it was a line being put together for people who wanted to come watch the 49ers play in Bayview, but that no one had actually talked to them about what was most important and what fit their needs and how they could plug into workforce development opportunities. And so that was really, even as an employment lawyer, when the world of transportation really opened up to me, and I realized how key transportation is to so many of our other social justice issues. It's really one of the main pieces of thread that sews together so much of our social justice fabric. So I, used to be a lawyer, but luckily I'm a recovering lawyer. And as a recovering lawyer, I now work in transportation. I went to a bike coalition where I was an executive director, completely fell in love with the field. And now I'm at a private planning firm, Toole Design. And what I love about Toole Design, we have planners, engineers, designers, researchers, and we can take things from a vision in our head and really implement it and put projects on the ground. But even more than that, I love that we're guided by three values: empathy, equity, and ethics. And as our director of equity and inclusion, I often talk about equity. And when we were first going on this journey as a company, one of the things that one of our staff members said is that focusing on equity isn't just important for the future of our company, but it's important for the future of our nation. And I think that's true. If you're not thinking about equity and all you do as a transportation professional, then you're not doing it right. And you're missing things. You have blind spots. And I think one of the things we did to really articulate that is write down what we mean by this. And for many people, they see that list in red and they're like, man, that's really long. You guys are trying to do it all. And the reality is that just as people, it's human nature. When you write something down and allow yourself to be held accountable to it, it makes an impact. And so one of the things that everybody should think about if they are trying to figure out what does equity mean in this work, start writing it down, start thinking about it, and start realizing that there has to be some accountability. So that's a little background about me. That's a little background about Tool Design. But I really want to talk about what you're all here to talk about: new mobility in the midst of this global disruption. And when I was learning more about the conference, I remember seeing this quote on the website, and just really, how do the changes we're seeing impact equity, health and safety, the economy, and the environment? And that's even more true with COVID-19, we have to constantly be thinking, what is the impact of the changes we're making? Are the changes going to stay? Everywhere you look, you hear new normal, new normal, new normal. And I think in order to understand the new normal, I think about it in a couple of ways. I think about where we were before, and I think about where we are now. And then I think, is that new normal something we want to stick with? So where were we before? Well, one of our speakers earlier today, Salita Reynolds, um, who gave an amazing talk. Before all of this, she and I were riding our bikes to the Oscars with one of the producers of Mad Men, and just loving all that bike share and micromobility offered. Micromobility was an emerging technology, right? It had started in late 2017, and it was slowly growing, and we saw things changing from just bikes to scooters. And there was this potential that there could be a mode shift, and we saw in some European countries that was probably more true. And then we just saw the potential. We saw that there was this potential of what these forms of micromobility could do for our trips. And when you think about kind of what was our trips, and when you think about kind of what was our trips, and when you think about kind of what was our trips, and when you a lot of people think about, and that's what Urbanism Next had some really great research about. And so when you think about this idea about the potential of where everything was, then some people might be thinking, I'm just trying to get back to normal. But the reality is, when you dig deeper on that potential, you see there were a lot of unkept promises, right? There was still a huge gender divide, and who was actually thinking that these things were for them. Income mattered. A lot of these emerging technologies aren't necessarily affordable for everyone. And then, when I look at this data, the question I always ask is, can we even talk about race? As a Black person, when I enter a room, I say, where are the other Black people? People who aren't Black need to start asking, where are the other Black people? People who don't have a disability need to start asking, what about folks with disabilities? We need to realize that sometimes when we think about the new normal, we're thinking about it from a perspective that skews young, male, and affluent, just like the users of these devices. And one of the folks I love, and people who have heard me speak before know that sometimes I fangirl out for Jane Jacobs, is this quote: "Cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody." And whether or not you're talking about scooters, or whether or not you're talking about other types of shared use mobility, what you actually realize is that it's not, we're not building cities for everyone. And that's in the private sector, that's in the government sense. When you look at folks who are in leadership and who are in decision making powers, the demographics look the same as on that previous slide. And again, this was true even in the old normal, when things were theoretically okay, right? When Uber first published their diversity numbers, you saw that most of their staff were men and were white. And that when you looked at leadership, that disparity only got worse. And it was an industry trend, right? The same was true at Lyft, where a majority of folks were white. And there were, they had a larger proportion of women. But again, when you go to the leadership, those differences get even starker. And so there's this idea that the old way of doing things was great. But for many of us, and for people who look like me or who go through life um, being different, we have the realization that the old normal wasn't necessarily that great. But now we have this new normal, right? We have this normal where I can't go out on a walk with my son without making sure that we're protected, and that we know what's out in the world. And in this new normal, wearing a face covering, for some might feel like the least of it, right? This is our worst job loss. Um, We are seeing that in every single sector, private sector, government, public agencies. We're seeing that in, some of our tech companies. And when the last recession happened, I was just graduating from law school as an employment lawyer. And so I know how hard it was then. And this is just something we haven't seen before. From company to company, we're seeing how bad it can get. But there's also a lot of people who feel like there are many opportunities. Happy Urbanist is a group in LA of folks who try to get together for happy hour. But happy Urbanist is also a term that I would use to describe many of my peers in our industry who see this as an opportunity. And I love Salita's quote earlier about opportunism not being a permission slip for nonsense. And I think it's a fine line between thinking that this is an opportunistic time, right? But we are seeing that COVID-19 is showing some ways that cities can be resilient, right? This was an article about how the impacts of coronavirus were allowing micromobility to fill the gaps. Some of us live in places that have done slow streets, where people are really championing taking over the streets for other modes of transportation. But again, this isn't an industry led predominantly by folks who skew male, white, and affluent. And for many of us, this is a totally different feeling. Naomi Dorner is a good friend and peer in this industry, who works at Nelson Nygaard, is their head of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think this is a feeling so many of us feel. Just this need to scream whenever we hear people say this is such an opportunity, because often those people are not the ones most impacted by this. If you look at any research about who's getting arrested for not social distancing, who's getting dragged off of public transportation, who knows somebody who's been killed by COVID 19? The disproportionality between white people who know someone who's been killed and people of color who know someone who's been killed is astounding. And so when those are the folks in decision making positions, sometimes it's hard for them to understand the reality of what the rest of us are going through. And this is something that I think about a lot. I don't want to go back to normal because just being better than it is now shouldn't be enough. I'm a black person in this country, and I know that the old normal meant that my life was expendable, and I know that the new normal means that my life is expendable. I know that people in my community are dying at a higher rate, and if we can outlive COVID-19, we still have to worry about jogging in our neighborhoods. We still have to worry about if we get on a scooter or a bike share and someone thinks we belong. And so I think it's really important for us when we think about the new normal versus the old normal, who is defining normal, and why are some of us really, really recoiling from this idea of this is such an opportunistic time? And the reality is because we have experienced a different life. And I always tell people, if you don't have black friends, I don't trust you. And so you really have to ask yourself, if the people of color who you know in your life, if you are a non-person of color, if the people of color you know in your life who you know best are just colleagues and coworkers, what can you do to better understand what folks are actually going through outside of your normal bubbles? And when we think about what to do, there's a couple of things, right? First, we have to understand the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're all important, but they're not the same. Diversity is really just saying we want unique perspectives at the decision making table. We want a clip art version of diversity where we put the white guy in the back and just surround him with women, and put the person in the wheelchair up front, right? And that is different than inclusion. Inclusion actually requires a shifting of power. It requires that those diverse folks who you're bringing to the table actually have some decision making ability. And that is sometimes difficult for folks to think about relinquishing power. And that's actually still different than equity, right? And equity, I like to say inequity because what we're actually talking about is overcoming inequities. And so many people love this picture. I feel like this picture really helps get the difference between giving everybody the same thing and giving folks what they need, right? Equity, really, in its simplest form, is folks who have historically had the least get the most. But this is an outdated picture because it doesn't really speak to realities. It doesn't really speak to where some people are starting, and it actually doesn't address that we should be fighting for liberation, especially in in transportation when we should be fighting for letting people go. And last, I'll just say that, if you're really fighting for liberation, then you have to be talking about power and privilege. Equity has become a buzzword, and it's not just a one size fits all. And so if you really want to talk about equity and do equity work, you have to be able to talk about race, you have to be able to talk about anti-racism, and you have to be able to talk about power and privilege. You have to know the difference between a brave space and a safe space. Many of us never feel safe. So if you want to do this work, you have to get out of this idea that you just want to make everybody comfortable. Discomfort helps us move forward. And in order to be uncomfortable and still progress on this work, you have to be brave. And then you have to understand the role power plays and analyze and challenge privilege. And a group of us, a collective of folks predominantly led by women of color, predominantly led by Black women, came together and put together a framework, which you can find at this link. And it just takes you through, if you're coming up with an idea or a project and you want to know, like, is this equitable? We have a series of questions, a framework that you can run yourself through, that you can ask yourself questions. What would it look like if this problem is solved? Who consistently suffers from it not being solved? Who are we gonna sacrifice if this doesn't go well? All of these questions that if you ask yourself, you're gonna get some uncomfortable answers, but hopefully it will get you to a place where you realize that the old normal isn't what we should be going back to. So just one more time, if we could just ask that poll question again and see if folks have a different understanding perhaps of, a lot has changed during this global health pandemic, but for many of us a lot has stayed the same or become further exacerbated. So who now wishes things would just go back to normal?
Tamika, thank you so much.
What a change.
What a
Let's
change.
just end it there. Post test successful.
Yeah. I've really been struck in so much of the news about COVID and kind of what's been happening to our communities. And again, just how in so many different areas, it really is showing the disproportionate impact that COVID is even having on our communities of color. So from who's getting sick, who is dying, who's getting arrested, like all those things that you said. And so as communities, so like the people that are listening are a lot of community leaders, and they're going to be under some incredible financial stress, as well as other types of resource stress. But they really want to not go back to the old normal. They want to create a new future that is much more equitable, that is better for everyone that's in their community. What would be, and especially thinking specifically about maybe the transportation sector, what should they be focusing on first that's really going to get them closer to a place we really want to, and a community we really want to live in?
I always think it's important to first be thinking on what we can do as individuals. So part of it is just understanding that we all have a role to play. And I know that sounds counterproductive because people always want, like, what's the toolkit on getting to equity, right? Like, what's the list? What's the thing I can bring out? And even with our framework, it's a series of questions to just start the conversation, because the reality is, if there's a first thing people should do, it's getting comfortable with the idea that there's probably going to be more questions than answers. And that doesn't seem like a direct answer, but it's so important, because if we can't get to a place of being okay with the fact that there's going to be uncertainty and there's going to be more questions, then we're always going to be just moving through trying to put checks on a list, not doing the actual work. And then I think it's listening deeply to people. I think, that's part of Salita's not being a permission slip for nonsense. Like, you have to listen. And sometimes in our desire to be helpful, we just want to boom, 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 get things done. And the reality is, if you get things done without listening, you're probably going to have to go back and do it again.